Hello, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about Sefirat Omer, the counting of the Omer, and the connection to something maybe which seems unconnected, but the Bar Kokhva revolt of 132 to 135 of the Common Era. And it might not seem connected, but I think that after you hear this talk, you're going to understand the connection. So without further ado, let's talk a little about Sefirat Omer. It says in the Torah, "Usfartem lachem mimocharat Shabbat," you shall count from the day after the Sabbath. Miyom aviachem et Omer at Nufa, from the day that you brought the barley offering. Sheva Shabbatot mimod, 7 full weeks. Ad michorat Shabbat Hashvit, until after the 7th Sabbath. You shall count 50 days. Those are the 49 or the 50 days between, in our tradition, the second day of Passover and the festival of Shavuot, which in Greek is also referred to as Pentecost, referring to the 50th day. Shavuot, of course, is a holiday which has no date in the Jewish calendar. In that sense, it's an anomaly. You count 50 days from the second day of Passover, and that's Shavuot. There's an interesting interpretation that says, since Shavuot in our tradition is also the giving of the Torah, so there was one who once wrote, that's why Shavuot therefore cannot have a date, because it has to be above time to receive the Torah. And how do we get the Shavuot? We count. Meaning human beings have to show initiative and desire in order to receive the Torah, because it doesn't just fall into your hand, you have to jump a little bit to receive it. So therefore you have Passover, which is 7 days, but according to our tradition, from the second day of Passover, which is called the day after the Sabbath, because the first day of Passover, like a Sabbath, there is a prohibition of work. So we count 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuot, which every year comes out on the 6th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan. Now, the relationship between Passover and Shavuot agriculturally is obvious. The Torah refers to the Passover holiday in the whole month of Nisan as Chag HaAviv, which means the festival of the spring. So it's a festival of the spring and the festival of planting agriculturally. And the Bible also refers to Shavuot as the festival of the harvest, Chag HaKatzir, which is one of the reasons why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, because it all happens during the barley harvest, which in the land of Israel extends from Shavuot time all the way into the summer. By the end of the summer, at the end of the agricultural year, you have the festival of Sukkot in the Hebrew month of Tishrei, somewhere around the end of September, and it's called the festival of ingathering of the crops. But so if we look at just Pesach and Shavuot, they seem to be related. You have planting, you have harvesting. Now, there's another relationship you can see, and that's the Sukkot holiday has 7 days in Israel. And then there's the 8th day is an additional holiday called Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly. And the relationship then for you have 7 days of Sukkot, which is called tabernacles, and then the 8th day is Shmini Atzeret, the day of the 8th day, which is the assembly. And it's actually called the 8th day of assembly, Shmini Atzeret, even though it's considered a holiday by itself. Interestingly enough, between Passover and Shavuot, right, there are 3 pilgrim holidays, 3 regalim. It's Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So Sukkot relates to this Shmini Atzeret, this 8th day of the assembly. And Passover seems to relate also to Shavuot, because you're counting from Passover to Shavuot. And in addition, the Talmud always refers to Shavuot as Atzeret, the day of assembly, which is exactly the name of Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, which comes out of Sukkot, which seems to bring the idea that possibly there is a relationship from the 7 days of Passover to Shavuot, just like the relationship of Sukkot to Shmini Atzeret. The only difference is that Shmini and Seret and Sukkot are back to back. They're one after another in concession consecutively. However, there are 7 weeks that stand apart between the first day of Passover and Shavuot. But it's without knowing why there are these 7 weeks, and 7 weeks sound like the 7 days, like an extension of the 7 days of Passover. So you would think that this time, then, this relationship between Passover and Shavuot would be a time of jubilous anticipation. It's the planting season. We're waiting for the harvest now that we planted. And even spiritually, we left Egypt, which is Passover, and we're in anticipation for the receiving of the Torah, which according to our tradition, also happened, meaning when God said the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people, according to our tradition, was also on the 6th of Sivan at that time. So, why then is Sfirat Omer not a time of jubilation? It should be. Biblically, there's no reason that it should not be. It's a time of anticipation. It's a time that we, after leaving Egypt, are now looking forward to the receiving of the Torah. And even in the agricultural year after we planted, we're looking forward to the harvest and the bread offering in the temple after we ate chametz, unleavened bread during Passover. It should be a time of progression, of development, of jubilation. And finally, we hit the giving of the Torah. So what happened that in Jewish history, the counting of the Omer became days of avelut, of mourning? It doesn't seem to harmonize with the holiday season that we are in between. Well, the Talmud tells us a story. The Talmud says that Rabbi Akiba had 24,000 students, and all these students died in a magefa, in an epidemic, which happened between Passover and Shavuot, which they refer to as Atzeret, the Day of Assembly. Except for the 33rd day of the Omer, which we call Lag BaOmer. On that day, they didn't die. There's a discussion, does it mean only on that day they didn't die, or from that day on? Princess the Maharal of Prague points out that Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of Omer, every year falls on the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar. 18 in Hebrew is Chai, which means life. So they didn't die on the day of life of Iyar. And he says from the 33rd day, which is the 18th of Iyar, until the 6th of Sivan, which is the Shavuot holiday, you have another 17 days, and 17 is the numerical value of the word Tov, which is good. Those are the good days, as opposed to the days leading up to then, which were days of mourning. So, what does this mean that the students of Rabbi Akiba all died within 33 days from an epidemic? What epidemic was it? It's interesting that we're now in days of epidemic exactly during the county of the Omer, which is also interesting. Even more interesting that they're planning to lift all the quarantine by Lag BaOmer, by the 33rd day of the Omer, or at least most of it. Let's talk about Akiba a little bit, and then I'll come back to this point. Rabbi Akiba, according to our tradition, was a shepherd as a young man. And in that time, it was very hard to study Torah. You had to have connections, be rich during the time of the Tanaim. And Akiba was an unlearned, nice person. And as a shepherd, he was working for a rich family in Jerusalem whose name was Kalba Savua. Kalba Savua, the Talmud says in Gittim, why was this gentleman called Kalba Savua? Because if you went into his house, hungry like a dog, Ra'ev Kakelev, you would leave Savua, you would leave satiated. Because he was very hospitable, and he must have had a free kitchen for the poor. So he was both a rich man and extremely charitable and hospitable. So Akiva worked for him, and then one day he met Kalba Savua's daughter, Rachel, and they sort of hit it off. And he said, Rachel, I would really be interested if you were interested in me. And Rachel said, unfortunately, you're an ignoramus. I cannot marry somebody who knows nothing, not educated. You don't know any Torah. Akiva said, okay, what should I do? Just tell me what to do. Said, you go study Torah, and then we got a deal. Said, okay, if that's the deal, I'm going to study Torah. So that's what happened. They got married. Her father disowned the couple because he was really angry at the fact that his daughter would marry an ignoramus, an uneducated shepherd, and disinherited her from the future inheritance. And Akiva and his wife Rachel went to live in poverty. The story goes Akiva kept his side of the promise. He went to study. And first, since he knew nothing, he had to study with children in the cheder, as they call it, in the room with the children, the school for children. And he learned the alphabet, and he learned a few other things, and it was very difficult starting the road at the age of 40, which he was at the time. And the story was one day he just was full of despair that he would never get anywhere, and he walked and he went south to the Judean desert, and he just sat there on the side of a mountain looking at the blue sky and thinking. And he wondered, how can anything go into this brain? I'm too old already. Can't start studying at 40. And then he noticed a drop of water that was just dropping drop by drop on a stone. And that stone had a major crevice in it, like a big hole that was caused by these drops of water. And Akiva looked in amazement. Could it be that these little drops of water made such a crevice in such a strong stone? He said, if that is possible, then maybe if I keep studying, somehow the stone in my brain will turn into a real brain and it'll be able to be pierced with knowledge and I'll actually get something out of this. So motivated again, he went back to the study hall, started with the children, continued with the adolescents, joined with the adults, and with a few years, he was the top of the academy and received rabbinic ordination. Story continues. After 12 years, Akiva had many, many students, but he decided time to go home. By the way, I must say, the story sometimes is misunderstood. Akiva did not leave home totally for 12 years. According to Jewish law, that's also not allowed. If you look in the Talmud, in the Mishnah and Ketubot, there are obligations a husband has to his wife. Probably he came back on the weekends because that's the minimum and maybe more than that. But it means that instead of working for the family, instead of spending his time like a husband should, he really spent his days and his nights coming back probably late, studying Torah because that was the deal, and he took it very seriously. When the 12 years was over, he said, it's time for me to go back to be a normal husband and to do this right. Story goes, after 12 years, he comes back and he hears from the window Rachel, his wife, arguing with the neighbor. And the neighbor says, the woman who's her neighbor says, what a terrible husband you have. 12 years he goes to study. What does he do at the house? Rachel says to the neighbor, if you would ask me for another 12 years to study Torah, like that I would give it to him. Kiva heard that, he decided, I'm signing up for another 12 years because that's what she wants. And that's what I want. And he did. And after 12 years, another 12 years, 24 years, and there's a lot of symbolism in the years, the 24, we'll get back to the 24, like the 24,000 students. So after 24 years, he comes back to town, and his 24,000 students are with him. Again, numbers here are a little symbolic, but definitely had many students. And as he comes back to town, Rachel comes to see him. And she falls down on his feet and grabs his legs and starts to cry. And the students don't like this. Who's this woman who's grabbing the rabbi's legs? Akiva turns to the students and says, leave her alone, because my Torah and your Torah are all because of her. Just one point before we continue of Akiva, my little proof that he was at home during the 24 years. There are other Talmudic stories about Akiva and Rachel, about their extreme poverty in those first years, about how he wanted to bring her a beautiful necklace, which was called Jerusalem of Gold, which he wanted to save up money in order to give to her because he knew that she really wanted it. So there are some stories about that period. So again, it does not mean that he left the house totally. It means that he spent most of his time studying Torah during that time. So the story goes, now Akiba, the Talmud says, was very close with Bar Kokhva. The Rambam in his Mishneh Torah, which is in the laws of judges and the laws of wars, he says that, he calls Rabbi Akiba, he says, Nosei Kelav Shel Ben Kuziba. He was the right-hand man, the vessel carrier, the arms carrier of Shimon ben Kuziba. Shimon ben Kuziba, Simon ben Kuziba, was the actual name of Bar Kokhva. He was referred to as Bar Kokhva, which means the son of the star, based on the verse in the prophecy of Balaam in the book of Numbers. Bamidbar, where Balaam says, Darach Kochav miYaakov v'kam shevet miYisrael. A star shall shoot forth from Jacob, and a tribe shall stand up in Israel. So because of that, he was nicknamed Bar Kokhva. So Maimonides says that Akiba, Rabbi Akiba, and all the sages of his generation stood behind the Bar Kokhva revolt. They really thought that this Shimon Bar Kokhva knew what he was doing, and there was a chance of finally getting Jerusalem back from the hands of the Romans after the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was the year 70, and the Bar Kokhva revolt starts in 132. Now, in a sense, there was, despite the fact that the Bar Kokhva revolt failed, but for 3.5 years it was quite successful. They actually did take back Jerusalem. They printed coins annually for 3 years in Jerusalem. And every time it said the first year to the freedom of Jerusalem, the second year, the third year. Now let's go back to the first Talmudic story about the Omer, and then we'll tie this together. The first Talmudic story says that Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students, and most of them died between Passover and Shavuot, except for the day of the 33rd of the Omer. So let's assume till the 33rd of the Omer, because of an epidemic. Now, what type of epidemic only strikes the students of Rabbi Akiva and nobody else? Maybe there was another epidemic, we don't know about it. And what's an epidemic that lasts for 33 days in those days? There's a letter from Rabbi Shvira Gaon. It's called the Epistle of Shvira Gaon of the 8th century Babylonia. He was one of the Geonim of Babylonia in the 8th century, and in his famous letter talking about the tradition of how the oral tradition was formulated, he mentions this story of Akiba and his students. And he says that this Magefa, which we usually translate as an epidemic, was not an epidemic, he says. It was a shmad by the Romans. A shmad means when a non-Jewish sovereignty starts making edicts against Jewish practice. By the way, we know for a fact that right after the Bar Kokhva revolt, Tinius Rufus, or Turnus Rufus, as he's called in our tradition, who was the head of the Jews in Palestine, the area of Palestine for the Romans at the time, he actually made edicts against Jewish practice right after the Bar Kokhva revolt. But the point is that according to Shvira, this Magefan, which they died, was not an epidemic. It was something that this non-Jewish government, meaning the Romans, had decreed against the Jews. Well, we know what happened. There was a war that went on. And if Akiba was a staunch supporter of Bar Kokhva, probably his students as well. And therefore, this epidemic, this Magefa, is probably a euphemism which really means, or a hint, which really means they died in a major bloody battle, which was probably a decisive battle, which happened exactly at this time between Passover and the 33rd day of the Omer. And because of that, it transformed these days, which should have been of jubilation, into extensive mourning. There are no marriages that take place during this time. We don't cut our hair. Some people don't shave at all. Some people just right before Shabbat. We try to refrain from major musical festivities, like live music concerts and things like that, which we happen to be doing anyhow now because of what's going on here with the corona. But I'm just saying, it basically, you might say, imposed a period of mourning on the time of the Omer. But if we look back and we remember why this period of mourning happened, we remember the story of Akiba and his students. So, what does it all mean? The Bar Kokhva revolt was a major tragedy after a short period of success, 3.5 years of success. But then the Romans decided they were going to make a statement. It's interesting that the Bar Kokhva revolt is actually hinted to not just here in Sefirat Omer. It is actually mentioned in Talmud in a few places, in the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian, but very few places. Remember, it's not, in the end it failed, so it wasn't the greatest thing to remember. The Talmud has a tendency, when there are things it doesn't want to remember, it just skips over them. For instance, the story of Masada, totally missing from the Talmud, because Masada not only was a failure in the sense everybody committed suicide, but it's not the type of thing that educationally we want to talk about, Jews committing suicide. So the Talmud is just hush-hush about Masada. If it wasn't for Josephus Flavius, we wouldn't know anything about that story, which eventually was found later on in the early 60s by Israeli archaeologists from the air, actually. So there are actually 3 places in the Talmud which hint to the Bar Kokhva revolt, 3 things that actually happened during the time of Akiba. The first one, as I said, was this Sfirat Omer, which was probably enacted by the students of Akiba. This idea of mourning during this time. The second one is in the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, the blessing after meals. The blessing after meals has 4 blessings. The first one is called Birkat Hazan, the blessing over food and sustenance. The Talmud says, where does that blessing come from? The Talmud says, it goes back as far as Moses, when the manna fell in the desert. So it's ascribed to Moses. Okay. The second blessing is called on the land and on the food, ala aretz v'ala mazon. Talmud says, who is that ascribed to? The Talmud in Brachot, and it says, it's ascribed to Joshua, because he brought us into the land. The third bracha is called Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim, who builds Jerusalem with mercy. Talmud says, who is that ascribed to? Talmud says, to David and Solomon. David, who wanted to build the temple, and Solomon, his son, who did. This is ascribed to them. And then the Talmud says, but what's the fourth blessing? Hatov v'meitiv, the good one who does good. What is that? Talmud says, that's a different story. That happened after the destruction of the second temple, or the Talmud's not clear if it's after or during. It talks a little bit vague. And it says there was a city called Beitar. And this was a huge city with many, many people. But unfortunately, the Romans killed the people of Beitar. And they did it in such a barbaric way that they left the corpses there for months to rot in the sun. And the day where the new Roman emperor gave the decree to allow the Jews to finally bury those bodies, that's when they enacted the fourth blessing of the grace after meals of Birkat HaMazon, Hatov v'Amitiv, that God does good, because even relative good is good. Very strange. A blessing over Beitar. What was this Beitar? Well, when you look into the history, Beitar was significant at one point in our history, and it was the Bar Kokhva revolt. You see, the plan of Simon Bar Kokhva was like this. The goal was to take Jerusalem. But as a good military expert, he knew that the Romans were going to do everything to crush the attempt to take Jerusalem. In fact, they were amazed that they were able to hold on to Jerusalem for 3 years. And then the Romans sent in a whole division, but they had plan. There was a plan B. And the fallback plan was the city of Beitar, just south of Jerusalem, a few kilometers, today just after Beit Shemesh. And the fallback plan was that if the Romans take over Jerusalem, we'll fall back to Beitar, which is a fortress and heavily defended. And probably because it's not an important city, the Romans will leave us alone. So the Romans took over Jerusalem after 3.5 years, and they fell back to Beitar. Unfortunately, though, they misjudged the Romans, and they were so angry, they decided they were going to go right to the end. And they took that whole division to Beitar, and they ransacked and pulverized Beitar until the whole place burned down, and they killed whoever they could. And they left the bodies as a testimony for months to rot in the sun. And the day that these bodies were finally buried, months later, was a day of thanksgiving that at least they could do that. And that, according to our tradition, is the fourth blessing of Birkat Hamazon Atav Meitiv, which people don't even realize is referring to the Bar Kokhva revolt. And probably because of Rabbi Akiva, who is very instrumental in many things in our tradition. One other thing, for instance, the Haggadah of Pesach, which is formulated, a lot of the formulation happens during Akiva's time. If you remember, there's a story there about Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Lazar, who are sitting in Bnei Brak and discussing leaving Egypt all night long until their students come to them and say to them, "Rabbis, it's time for the morning service to say Shema." And already Marcus Lehman pointed out, and others have pointed this out too. This is strange. The students telling the rabbis it's time for the morning prayer, when don't the rabbis see that it's light outside? So they say that this is actually a symbol. It's referring to the fact that Akiba and the sages were discussing the Bar Kokhva revolt. And when the students come in and say, "Rabbis, stop talking about the Egypt story, it's time for the Shema," which means it's enough talk, let's have some action. So, in 3 places, or as the Bar Kokhva revolt hinted to. The third one, okay, is more of a hint. The first 2 are obvious for those who know the history of that time. But because the days of the Omer relate to these students of Rabbi Akiva who probably fell in a battle of the Bar Kokhva revolt, it becomes so much more meaningful that the days that were added later on to these days, meaning the Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, and Yom Yerushalayim, the day that we unify Jerusalem, happened during these days of the Omer, which means it transform these days into days of jubilation. So that same Bar Kokhva revolt, which wanted to bring back Jewish sovereignty, which wanted to take over Jerusalem, but failed during these days when we tried to take over Israel and succeeded, and then we tried to unify Jerusalem and succeeded, they become a redeeming act of the failure of the Bar Kokhva revolt. And therefore it is our hope that all the days of the Omer be filled with such days of jubilation, of Jewish renaissance, of establishing firmly our sovereignty in this country, a country of freedom, Judaism, democracy, and peace. And by this renaissance in our times, hopefully, finish it in our times, this will transform the days of Omer from a time of mourning, again into a time of jubilation, and we will be able to anticipate the Shavuot holiday with joy and with thanksgiving. Shalom, shalom.